Good evening, everyone. I'm Jean Durbin, president of the PCDO, and we're so happy to have you here for our second virtual meeting. I want to take a moment before we start and introduce our wonderful guests, just to say a big thank you. A thank you to our mayor, Liz Lempert, for her extraordinary leadership during this crisis. For just incredible communication efforts and being open and transparent with information, advocating on our behalf before the state. The COVID-19 website's been extraordinary, and basically pushing out resources for people in our community that are in need. Thanks to, of course, all the first responders, police, fire, EMTs, nurses, doctors, pharmacists, the visible and invisible workers who are helping our world still continue to go around, keeping us healthy, keeping our buildings clean, ensuring we have food, water, lights, electricity, fuel for our vehicles. They are often invisible and nameless, and I want to say a huge thank you to them. Thanks to our community for all that you are giving. You're giving time, money, and resources to care for each other. And it's been meaningful and makes me proud to be a part of this community. Thanks to Governor Murphy for his strength and real courageous leadership and commitment in advocating for us, and also networking across the country to approach the pandemic and the crisis in its wake in a thoughtful and strategic manner. With true leadership and compassion. Can't say enough thanks. We do hope that this crisis will enable us to come out on the other end better and strengthened with a real awareness and a renewed commitment to meet head-on challenges that are before us to ensure equity and access for everyone. Access to things like a living wage, access to healthcare, unfettered access to women's healthcare, access to free quality education, access to affordable secondary education, access to housing, jobs, the right to vote, and a voice in how our democracy works, access to fair and equitable treatment in the workplace, including pay equity. And while many of us can shelter in place and stay safe and be at home and work from home, many cannot. And really, it's just disgraceful what's happening with the lack of leadership in Washington, the demeaning, dangerous, and deranged tweets, which serve to divide our country and pathetically place blame on some of our most courageous leaders at the state and local levels. It's demoralizing, and hopefully tonight is going to be a way to help us lift ourselves up from that demoralizing place. This year matters. We have to be unrelenting in our efforts to get out the vote and to elect Joe Biden president. We have our down ballot races to remember. That's Senator Cory Booker and Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman, as well as the effort to flip New Jersey blue. At the county level, we have some races, including our first guest this evening, County Clerk Paula Sollami Covello. We're so happy to have you here with us. Paula has, I wanted to share my screen, if I may. Give me 1 second. Can you see that? Thanks. So Paula has been, was first elected in 2005, and really she's been an extraordinary county clerk for us. In terms of bringing order and communicating with us and getting the results out in a transparent and timely way. We're really looking forward to speaking to you this evening about what's happening with our new primary, the primary date that's been moved, and what you see on the horizon for us. We also have Assemblyman Andrew Zwicker, who really needs no introduction. But he's going to give us the scoop on what's been happening, give us the lay of the land at the State House, including pending legislation that would be really helpful if we could get passed. And that's something we can work on as a community as we move forward with a virtual election. Then we also have a wonderful guest, Daly, a best-selling author of Ratf and his new book, Unrigged. We're so excited to have you here. Dave has appeared in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Slate, the Washington Post, and New York Magazine. He is a senior fellow at Fair Vote and the former editor of Salon, and he lives in Massachusetts. And his book, Unrigged, is really the focus of what he's going to speak with us tonight about. And we're looking forward to the journey that took you from your first book to your second book. And the subtitle of Unrigged is How Americans are battling back to save democracy. So excited to hear from you. First, let's turn to Paula, if I may. Paula, can you unmute and say good evening if you'd like? I think you're still muted.
Good evening. Did that work?
That worked.
Good. Okay.
Thank you. So first question for you, Paula. Can you tell us how likely it is that our July 7th election is going to be all vote by mail?
Yes. Okay. Well, I can't answer that, but let me start off by saying that as many people may not know, the election was moved from June 2nd to July 7th. That was a call by Governor Murphy. And based on that, he had decided that it would be a good move in order to give us more time to mail out the vote by mail ballots, either if he goes to an all by mail vote by mail election, or if he does not go to an all vote by mail election. Because from what I'm understanding, he's leaning toward it to going to an all vote by mail election, but he's getting pushback. Some of the North Jersey counties would like to see not see an all vote by mail election. Some of the South Jersey counties would like to have an all vote by mail election. So the governor is dealing with some political pushback and realities. And so I can't tell you what he's going to do. All I can tell you is that by the first week of May, I've got to make that order, and I've got to order those ballots so that we can start sending them out. Because if I'm going to send out 230,000 ballots to every registered voter in Mercer County, I've got to get started. So we're just trying to push him as election officials to make a decision quickly so that we can plan and we can order, because also getting all of these materials printed takes time. So that's where we are. We're waiting for the governor to make a decision.
How many vote by mail ballots has the county clerk received so far, or applications rather?
Well, first of all, we have 27,000 people on the permanent vote by mail list. That means that in the last few years, the governor has made it so that everybody gets a ballot for every election. If you voted in the 2016 presidential race, if you voted in 2017 or 18, vote by mail, you're automatically a permanent vote by mail voter. So we're sending out 27,000 ballots already. Plus we've got another additional about 3,000 or 4,000 that have come in above and beyond the 27,000. So we're planning on about 30,000 right now, and of course we have more time, so there will be more. But that is going to obviously change drastically by about 200,000 more if the governor says we're going to an all vote by mail primary. I will tell you, you don't have to worry about it in Mercer. I have a contract that is not signed, but I have someone ready to help me to send them out. It's because our office cannot do 230,000 ballots with the staff we have, especially with the social distancing requirements that we're going to have. So we have somebody ready to assist us in mailing them, and we are ready to go if we have to.
That's great. How do we compare with the rest of the counties across the state?
Well, I know there are other counties that have assistance from mail hubs. I've never used one before, but there are others that do. And I can tell you, I know that I've already got my person in place, and this person's experience. They also mail out our sample ballots for us in Mercer County. So I know they can handle this. I know I'm a little bit ahead of the curve, but I hope that all of us can do it and do it well.
Thanks. I have a couple of questions that have come in. What are your thoughts on applying for, well, before I ask you this question, I want to back up, because if there is not an order from the governor, it is up to us to apply for a ballot, a
Right.
vote by mail ballot.
Right.
If he does, make an executive order, then you're automatically sending the ballots to all 230,000 registered voters.
We believe so. We don't know if he's going to order us to mail them to all unaffiliated voters. He could just say mail ballots to all Democratic and Republican registered voters and not order us to send them to unaffiliated voters. So then it would be less, of course. But if we mail them to unaffiliated voters, we send them to both Democrats and we send them a Democratic and a Republican ballot, and then they mail back the ballot for the party in which they wish to vote, and then they become registered in that party. So we don't know if he's going to order that we send it to everyone, or if we send it just to the registered Democrats and Republicans. And so now to follow up with your question, we're ready.
Okay, thanks.
Saying we hear a lot around hospitals.
Whoops.
That goes like this.
Did anybody hear that?
Yes.
Pain is inevitable.
Who is that? Uh-oh, are we being hacked?
It didn't work. But I doubt the person who.
What are your thoughts on applying for a vote by mail application online?
Hold on one second.
Or maybe they didn't mean physical pain.
Trying to figure out that's
Maybe
where
they
that's
meant the
coming
other
from.
kind, the worst kind.
Okay. I don't know if that was me.
I think that's gone. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I thought we were
So,
being.
vote by mail application online. We currently don't have that capability in New Jersey. Thoughts on that becoming a reality? And I know Assemblyman Zwicker will speak to this as well.
We would love to have it. Right now, we would like to see, right now you have to mail it in your application with an original signature. We would love to have it be set up as we do with the overseas and military ballots, where you mail in a vote by mail, you fill out your vote by mail application and you sign it, then you scan it into your system, and then you email it to us with the original signature. I don't see why that wouldn't work, because we would then still have the original signature, but it is something that is not allowed except for overseas and military applicants at this time.
And so the issue is really verifying an original signature, and that's why we're not there yet.
Yes.
Okay. What concerns you? What concerns you most about the upcoming election, and what do you want people to know?
Well, obviously, cybersecurity is always something that we are concerned about. I'm part of a cybersecurity task force. I'm working with the state, county, and federal government on, homeland security issues, and they make us aware of any cyber threats that they learn of. If they know of something that's happening, we get reports and alerts. And we are being trained on how to deal with a cyber threat on election night, for example. They're doing everything they can to keep all election officials apprised of any possible issue. And then if there is an issue, how to respond to that issue immediately and notify voters. So they're trying, the federal government is taking it very seriously, Homeland Security and the county. I will say Brian Hughes has called several meetings on this with his IT staff and with all election officials. We're working very hard to avoid it, but it's always a concern and it's always a fear. You just can't plan for something sometimes. So no matter how well prepared we are.
I'd like to, if I could, show you the vote by mail, the application for vote by mail. Hang on one second. And we have a question about, some folks are, help explain to folks that if you apply for a vote by mail ballot, you don't have to do it for all future elections. You have a choice.
Right.
And that's something that's a little new. So could you talk about that?
Right. Well, it used to be that you could only choose for, if you wanted to be a permanent vote by mail voter, you would only be on it for the general. And you could either choose it for one election. If you're traveling, you always could do that. or you could choose for just every general. Like in last year, they made it so that you can apply for all future elections. And that means you don't have to reapply for every year for a primary ballot, a municipal ballot, a school ballot. You can apply once and you will get a ballot for every election. And that's why we have 27,000 people we're mailing ballots to this year, because we actually have that many people that want all future election ballots. So we will be mailing it to all of those people, plus whoever else applies for the single election that's coming up, the primary in June.
Okay, thanks. And then if you've already submitted a vote by mail application and the governor releases an executive order saying this is going to go forward, everybody's going to be mailed a ballot, what happens to your application?
Well, we're separating our applications. So if you apply for all future elections, you will be put in July to receive one going forward. And then everybody else will just get an automatic ballot. But we
Okay,
are going to make sure that anybody who fills out this ballot right now and checks that all future election box will be on the all future election ballot going forward.
okay, thanks. So you will take a look at everybody's applications that have come in thus
Yeah.
far. Thank you, Paula. Will you be able to stick around with us
Yeah,
for the
absolutely.
conversation? Okay, thanks. I wanted to turn it over to Assemblyman Zwicker and say thanks for continually highlighting donations to food banks as well as news about blood drives. Please let us know what's happening in the Assembly from your vantage point and help us prepare for the upcoming election.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you to Heather, who's taking questions, to Bill, who is the technical expert. It's a pleasure to be with our county clerk. And of course, nothing but my best wishes to everybody, to all of you and everybody who's listening, to you and your families. You know, at this point, we're all personally impacted by COVID-19. We know members of our family, our communities who have been. So wishing everybody just nothing but the best right now as we work together. Unity 2020 takes on even a stronger meaning, it seems, right now. What I'd like to do, Jean, is share a few slides. Some of this will get at what Paula just talked about. Some of it will set the stage for future, sort of the questions that are coming up. So let's see if I can share my screen. Okay. So I want to talk about what's happening in the legislature in general, and then in specific related to the July primary. I just got a few slides to take us through before opening up for questions. So first, the General Assembly met remotely for the first time March 25th, and then both the State Senate and the Assembly met on separate sessions on the same day on April 13th. This is the first time in New Jersey's history that there was a voting session from within, that was not within the State House. The legislation we've done so far has just about exclusively focused on COVID-19 and around three primary buckets: health and safety, economics, and elections, like we're talking about tonight. One of the things that has been raised as a concern is that all the legislation, and I have a list of that I'll show you in a minute, has bypassed the committee hearing process. So I'm going to show you a list of the legislation that both houses passed and the governor has signed, but both the Speaker of the General Assembly, Craig Coughlin, and the President of the Senate, Steve Sweeney, have expressed their concern about having to do what's called emergency legislation to bypass the committee hearing process. And so the legislature is looking at basically tools like we're using tonight to ensure that we can get to comments and public access to the legislation that we do moving forward. And there's still quite a bit to do. So This is the first of 3 pages of legislation. This is all what has been signed into law as of just a couple of days ago. And you can read this on your screen faster than I can talk through it, but you can see it does everything from providing immunity to healthcare professionals. It tries to ensure that those who join the hundreds of thousands and now the millions of people around the country who have lost their jobs, give them protection in terms of eviction, modified deadlines by which public agencies are required to respond to government records. It's changed the rules around public bodies and how one can conduct a meeting. There's extension of deadlines for budgets at the county and municipal level. There is the authorization of healthcare facilities to provide testing. Jean, you mentioned food insecurity and hunger is an enormous issue right now. I think we've all read a variety of different headlines in the paper. And certainly one of the things that has been rather heartwarming is seeing people coming together to assist those who are in need when it comes to food. We've also changed the rules around telemedicine, telehealth. One very relevant to the county clerks and to Paula is we already have provided an additional week in terms of mailing ballots for the primary election. There are requirements around school districts to provide school meals and meal vouchers for students who are on free or reduced price meals, requiring health insurance and Medicaid coverage for testing of COVID-19, emergency grants and low interest loans from the Economic Development Authority of New Jersey, time off from work protection when it comes to this state of emergency, family leave and disability benefit protection. We have changed, as I think everybody's aware, the deadline for filing of corporate business tax and also income tax, personal income tax. We've changed the fiscal year, which normally ends, the New Jersey state fiscal year, which normally ends June 30th. We've extended to the end of September. Nonprofit
Andrew.
Corporations can.
Andrew.
Yep.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yep.
Will you make these slides available
Absolutely.
after the? Okay, great.
I'll send them right to you.
I appreciate it.
Sure.
Could I ask us to focus on the bills that are relevant to the election?
How about that?
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Go back to that, right?
Only
so
because of
primary election. Boom.
I'm sorry, only because of time constraints. Thanks so much.
Okay. So we know we need to do something, maintain social distance, the health of our poll workers, which are typically elderly and vulnerable to COVID-19, and who would be responsible for sanitizing machines. Everybody's aware of the disaster that happened in Wisconsin. Of particular note, if you haven't seen that before, of the 180 polling places that typically are open in Milwaukee, only 5 were open during their primary. 200,000 people did not return their absentee ballots. 5 states already vote primarily by mail, which are listed there. 28 states, including New Jersey, have the right to vote by mail for any reason. You can see that in 2018, 26% of the ballots were done by mail. Here's what's happened historically in New Jersey. And you can see 2015, we were a little bit below 10%. It dropped down to about 8% in 2017. Last year, it was up about 15 to 17% because of what Paula mentioned, which is a change in some of the laws to allow automatic receiving of vote by mail ballots. Jean, to your point, there are basically 3 pieces of legislation to focus on right now. One, which is a bill that I introduced on March 5th, which comes from the tremendous work and advocacy of Action Together in New Jersey. And in particular, I want to give a shout out to Win Huang, the executive director, and Dan Janowski, the CIO. There's bipartisan support in the Assembly. This provides protection for voters. It has methods to ensure questionable ballots are retained and inspected. And it requires promotion of vote by mail by the New Jersey Secretary of State. It basically is going to standardize across all counties. And then finishing up, and then Jean, the floor is yours again. There is two other pieces of legislation, one that came up before, A 2175 to allow for online voter registration, and A 943, which would require mandatory postage be on all vote by mail ballots. As you heard from Paula, Governor Murphy has not decided whether to go to all or mostly vote by mail primary. Time is short and your advocacy is critical. So thank you to everybody, and thank you, Jean.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Paula, I know, wanted to chime in about a couple of deadline issues. You have to unmute.
Okay.
There you go.
Am I unmuted?
You are good to go now. Yep.
Okay, I just wanted to let you know that since the election date was changed, it obviously changed the calendar for vote by mail to be submitted to us. And so the deadline now for, well, first of all, the voter registration deadline was pushed back. So now voter registration can be done up until June 16th for the primary election. That means that the municipal clerks also will stay open late that evening, as well as the superintendent of elections, so that they can take voter registrations. So it's very important that you get voters to register, especially new people turning 18 this year. Additionally, on June 30th, that's the deadline to apply for a vote by mail ballot by mail. You can still walk into the clerk's office until July 6th and fill out an application and pick up a ballot right at the clerk's office until 3 p.m. on July 6th. But the deadline for mailing is June 30th. So when you have people doing their postcards and their advocacy, please remind people of the deadline. We don't want anybody to be shut out. And the election obviously is June 7th. They have changed the law so that when you mail back your ballot, you can mail it back as long as it's postmarked by election day, and we receive it within 48 hours of election day, it will be counted. That's a change in the law. It used to be that it had to be in by 8 p.m. on election day. Now it has to be postmarked by election day, but can be received up to 48 hours later. So that's a very positive change, because we had to turn, and they didn't count a lot of votes. And additionally, I wanted to let you know that Mercer County does pay for postage for all vote by mail ballots. So I wanted Andrew mentioned that in his speaking engagement, but I want to let you know that we are one of the few counties that already does pay for it. And that's so that no one is disenfranchised. No one has to feel they have to pay for their vote.
Thank you. That's great. Andrew, how likely is it that the bills 3591 and 2175 and A943, how likely is it that those are going to be signed by the governor?
We haven't even moved on them at all. So just so people are aware, currently there is not another legislative voting session on the docket, though there is talk of doing one in the next couple of weeks. So I really can't answer that. Also, much of this can be done by executive action, which would be quickly, which would be much preferable given the fact that, as we heard from Paula, the deadline, really the drop dead deadline, and I'll have to ask her if this is true, but I have to assume for all counties is roughly coming up in a couple of weeks. So given the incredibly short time frame, as much as possible, really would be preferred. It'd be preferred to be done by the governor.
Yes, we are all on the same time deadline. Some counties have more ballots to mail out than us. So we really do need to get that lead time.
Great.
One other thing I wanted to mention is that the poll, because they haven't made it an all vote by mail election yet, we still are looking, the Board of Elections is still looking for polling locations that can be open in July, that are maybe air conditioned and handicap accessible and all of those things. And additionally, they're looking for poll workers because they're afraid, we already have a shortage of poll workers, but now with people fearful of voting, they may lose poll workers. So they're looking for poll workers and polling locations. I just wanted to put that out on behalf of the Board of Elections.
So what's the best way to encourage the governor to take action? What should we be flooding the office with emails, calls, letters?
Andrew, I'll leave that to
emails, letters, I think are given the time constraints that we're under, are the fastest way to make sure that your voice is heard. So yeah, I would say emailing in particular would be the most effective.
Okay, thanks. Dave Daly, how are you?
I'm good. How's everybody?
Thanks for joining us.
Oh, a pleasure.
So if I could just start with a question and then
Sure.
free reign here. Throughout your research is very clearly the theme of justice and the importance of individual engagement to ensure a fair system. Your book titles, they're powerfully descriptive and your writing is really clear and accessible, fun to read. But Ratfucked and Unrigged come from two entirely different places. One is an expose and the other seems to come from a place of hope. Can you talk a little bit about your journey from the first book to the second and how you came to that place of hope, particularly now during what feels like a dismantling of our democracy with daily assaults on, decency and truth?
You're right about that. And it's been wonderful to listen to the Assemblyman and the Mercer County Clerk to hear the really important preparations that are underway for vote by mail and just the absolute importance of this in the middle of a pandemic when it is really, really clear that we're not going to be able to do the kind of in-person voting that's been so traditional. And the horror show in Wisconsin that ought to be a warning sign for all Americans that we do not want that to be our election in November. We don't want 5 of 180 polling places being open in major cities. We don't want our politicians in court the day before the election trying to postpone elections. And we don't want any more of those images of Americans in masks, socially distanced by 6 feet, some of them in wheelchairs, some of them in canes, around those 5 open polling places, some of them until midnight. It's horrifying. So thank you. Absolutely. Here's what I would say about hope. And I know that hope can be hard to come by right now. I know that these are tough days. They're days of isolation, of social distance. Just let me try to encourage you to keep that hope alive. And you're right. I mean, I say that as someone who, after a first book about gerrymandering and voter suppression, I often felt like I would come into these talks and have a black cloud over my head and kind of suck the air out of the room. So let me try not to do that this evening. I set off for this new book in search of hope. And I found it. I found it in really surprising places. I door knocked across Utah and Missouri and Michigan with these amazing canvassers who won astonishing redistricting reform in states deep shades of red and purple. And I watched as Native Americans in Utah and North Dakota, they mounted these frenzied pushes to determine their street addresses and to make themselves tribal IDs when the state legislature demanded the one form of identification that they knew they did not have. I went to Florida and I watched the amazing Mighty Moral Coalition that was built there around restoring voting rights to folks who had served their time after a felony conviction. A coalition of Black and white Democrats and Republicans, left, right, ex-cons and second chance believing churchgoers, tattooed Trump-loving deplorables and radical criminal justice reformers. And all of these groups, they won big and they won everywhere around the country. So we're in this moment, right, in which our not only in which we are feeling isolated and alone and anxious, but that our politics can just feel weighted down by this profound sense of despair when the news cycle just feeds this sense of never-ending exhaustion when we get up in the morning and feel like the first thing we have to do is check what kind of fresh insanity the president tweeted during his executive time. I got to ride along for a year alongside all of these democracy warriors who turned off cable news, who logged off of Twitter and got to work building the kind of country they wanted to live in. It was really an inspiring year.
Thanks. And I should back up. Your first book was about the effort to rig elections in favor of the Republicans, the Republican-driven gerrymandering red mapping from 2010 on, and so that's really enlightening. I'm wondering for all of you, what we're seeing now. What do you make of this current sort of rebel flag carrying COVID-19 protest thing that's going on, that's being, supported by our president?
So much of what we're seeing can be traced back to what was unleashed on our politics by this kind of radical extreme partisan gerrymanders in this decade, that it turned state legislatures around the country into these extreme, unaccountable bodies, and just put the craziest base of the Republican Party in control, and set them loose on our democracy. What you see coming out of these state legislatures over the course of this decade has been an assault on voting rights. It's been a voter ID and precinct closures and voter roll purges and elimination of days of early voting, and tightening restrictions on online registration and voter registration drives. It's been a war on labor. It's been a war on public education. It's been a war on the environment. It's been a war on women's reproductive rights. Ohio, Missouri, Alabama, and Georgia, deeply gerrymandered legislatures in those states that have advanced these, extreme heartbeat bills. You can trace what happened in Flint, Michigan back to gerrymandering. You had citizens in Michigan who upended the emergency manager law in a statewide initiative in 2012. And the gerrymandered legislature there didn't feel like they had to listen. It reenacted it 6 weeks later, put their emergency manager in charge in Flint, and he switches the city's water supply to the Flint River and unleashes a lead poisoning crisis and Legionnaire's disease. So I think what we're seeing around the country now is an outgrowth of what has been birthed upon our politics in this extreme, unaccountable way. It's put a small subsection of the Republican Party in control of the party. I mean, if you look at the polls, even most Republicans right now are in favor of social distancing. And one of the great things that I saw as I went around the country, and I hope that this can give us a little bit of optimism, is that all of these things that I chronicle in the book passed with 60, 70% of the vote in red states, in purple states. You don't get a restoration of felon voting rights in Florida with 64% of the vote if it's all Democrats. You don't get an expansion of Medicaid in Idaho at 62% of the vote if it's all Democrats. There's only like 14% Democrats in Idaho. You don't get redistricting reform in Utah, Colorado, Missouri, and Ohio at that number. So we can still persuade people, and there are still people out there that are persuadable outside of these social media bubbles, outside of our partisan news bubbles. We've got to continue to do the work of talking to people.
We had our own effort here in New Jersey, organized by the League of Women Voters and others. The PCDO participated as a member organization, lobbying for a fair districting approach as we move forward. And we were successful in that first round. And it really was a nonpartisan, bipartisan approach. And that was heartening. And so I'm not telling any secrets if I say that your book highlights all the great things about working together and not letting partisanship divide us. I have a question for anybody who wants to jump in. What are the best ways to work on voter engagement in the current stay-at-home environment, given where we are now? Andrew?
I mean, clearly telephone, digital means, email. We can't do the traditional canvassing, knocking on doors under the current environment, and it's not clear when that will be able to happen again. So anything and everything that we can do to communicate without knocking on doors, we have to start increasing significantly.
Thanks. Dave, your role at Fair Vote gives you, if you could talk a little bit about your role as a senior policy person at Fair Vote, and give us the general lay of the land, and in particular, if you can, speak to what the forecast looks like for New Jersey and Pennsylvania in terms of the presidential race and congressional races.
Yeah, they're going to be really, I mean, Pennsylvania obviously was super close in 2016. I think what we're heading towards is, in Pennsylvania, what I would highlight is that they did a really terrific job of passing a bipartisan electoral reform package there that did a lot towards expanding absentee balloting, expanding automatic registration, expanding ballot access, automatic voter registration. They did a really good job. And it's one of the rare states in which this has been nonpartisan. I mean, if you look around the country right now, what you tend to see are red states that have been putting up barriers to the ballot in the form of voter ID or all of those other kinds of restrictions we talked about, and blue states, coastal states that have been innovating, doing vote by mail, expanding, doing automatic voter registration, doing online voter registration, and they're going to be in a better position as we head into voting during a pandemic. One of the things that Pennsylvania could still do, Pennsylvania is not ready for 70% of its votes to come in and to be vote by mail ballots. And a lot of the states, Michigan included, states that have been expanding vote by mail have not also been expanding state statutes that require, that allow local election officials to begin counting these ballots early. And what you're going to see in Pennsylvania and Michigan, and I don't know what the law is in New Jersey, and I defer to the experts on this call, but if it's not something you're already thinking about, in most of these states, you might have seen 10, 12% of the vote come in absentee in the past. In Wisconsin, you're starting to see 70% of the vote come in early. And this is going to overwhelm election administrators who are underfunded, who are understaffed, who are going to have the exact race that the clerk was talking about, as far as being able just to print these ballots and get them out to people. We've got to allow for these votes to be counted early, for folks to begin the preparation of ballots, to start opening, to start thinking about counting. Because if we don't, and the numbers come in a little bit at a time, and people go to bed on election night thinking the results are in one place, and then all the mail ballots begin coming in over the next couple days, what is the president going to be tweeting about? It's all going to be lies about voter fraud, but it is going to confuse people. It's going to create clouds that shouldn't be there. We can prepare for it. We've got 200 days left, and we need to be preparing for what is coming on the voting front.
Andrew and Paula, what's the landscape in New Jersey in terms of when do we start counting?
Tell you that we start counting. We can start counting on election day, but that does mean that you could start at 12:01 a.m. The election day. The reality is that we don't. In Mercer, we start around 6 a.m. opening ballots, and with the numbers that we're talking about, we're going to need, and the Board of Elections is aware of it, extra scanners so that they can scan all of these ballots coming through. And we really do need extra lead time, as he's raised. So I think that might be in the form of legislation to our Assemblyman, or to an executive order of some sort, because there's a fear in New Jersey that if they do open them early, they could be corrupted and they could be replaced, and there are security issues related to early opening of ballots, and that's one of the reasons that New Jersey has not done it. So right now you can start immediately after midnight on election day, actually. So, we start around 6 a.m. and then it will probably take us several weeks to get final results with the staffing that we have now, even with additional scanners, unless we start earlier. That's just the reality.
And just echoing what Paula just said, there was a piece of legislation before COVID that would have allowed to what Paula just mentioned, to start counting early, but it died over concerns around security. That was a much different world that we were living in. I also just want to echo something, Paula, you just said, which is, and this has come up, you and all the clerks need money for the scanners too. And that's not something people have been talking about, but this is the scanners. You need to read these in quickly. And, if we were at 17% vote by mail last year, who knows where we're going to be before we move to an executive order that goes to an all VBM. So making sure every county has the equipment it needs. And then, we can debate, not here, but do we start counting early? Do we say, and I understand what you're talking about in the presidential election, but do we say we're not going to be able to announce the election, sometime in the evening of election day? There's pluses and minuses with each of these, but we're in unprecedented times. And I think, last thing I'll say on that, the key thing here is trust of the public. Whatever we're doing right now, whatever changes we make, and I'm speaking specifically in New Jersey, that would be true anywhere, has got to be in a way that the public has trust in counting the vote, the security of the vote, and then the final tally.
We did get some questions in about security. So one viewer says in Wisconsin, there were problems with the post office not postmarking ballots, not delivering them in a timely manner. Will the legislation or any of our New Jersey pending legislation mandate that the post office put a postmark on each ballot? And is 48 hours after the voting date sufficient time to receive the ballots?
Do you want to?
Paula, you can answer that last piece.
Okay, we have been working with the post office. We've met with them. We've discussed, their priorities so that they would make sure that vote by mail moves. It is a ballot. It's not a campaign solicitation, which has a different status with the post office. According to federal law, ballots and election materials have to move instantly. So they're tagging things differently to make sure they move. Unfortunately, we are still dependent on the U.S. Post Office for vote by mail. We have no choice about that. It is by mail. So we're hoping that the federal government funds the post office. We hope that the post office is running properly, and we're working with them to make sure that they are putting in procedures so that things will move quickly. And in terms of the 48 hours, well, the legislature did add that because there were many that were rejected when they weren't received by election day. People couldn't get them as they were postmarking them by the election day, but we do need a cutoff in order to count and certify the vote and get it out to people. People want final results. So that was the 48 hours is what the legislature came up with, felt it was reasonable. And that is where we are. At some point we do have to stop counting because we just it can't go on indefinitely. We've got to, give people results. Candidates want them. And that's basically why it goes the way it does.
How early is early enough to start counting without it being a risk or a gamble? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I mean, it's just a matter of security. I mean, like some states allow them to start counting before election day, 3 days before or a week before. And I'm sure that our expert can discuss that further. But New Jersey has a concern about security. You know, somebody could get in there and switch out ballots. You know, who knows what could be done. And so that's the reason they haven't allowed it.
Our election clerks and our election officials are about as trustworthy and serious and honest as it gets in this nation. And we do not have a voter fraud or an election fraud problem in this country. The number of fraudulent ballots over the course of a decade is so minuscule compared to the hundreds of billions of votes that are cast. It simply doesn't exist. We should allow these votes to begin being counted as early as the administrators say that they need them to be done, because they can be trusted. And the security problems, I understand that everybody wants elections to be free and fair and safe and secure. That is absolutely needs to be the gold standard. We have that. And what we need to do, if we're going to go from 10, 12, 17% vote by mail to 70, 75, 80% vote by mail, is understand that that is a completely different level of voting. And it requires a whole new level of funding, of preparation, of thoughtfulness, of care. And it's going to require some statutory changes on the other side so that these officials can begin doing the work that they have to do.
Thanks. One more question along these lines from a viewer. Please expand further on online voter registration and security. What if someone tries to hack online registration files?
Let Andrew discuss that. I think he's a computer person there.
So, I mean, it's with a hypothetical, I mean, and cybersecurity is the biggest concern with all of this. The proposed legislation is from my colleague Raj Mukherjee. It creates the ability just for the online voter registration, not for specifically VBM. But it does digitize signatures right from the motor vehicle database for New Jersey. But there's no easy way to answer how to guarantee 100% secure election. You know, minus emphasizing what David said, which is that voter fraud has been studied and checked around the country, and the number of actual voter fraud incidents is infinitesimally small. And so we are in an unprecedented time. And it seems to me the goal is, how do we disenfranchise the least number of people? How do we educate? I mean, because this is an enormous change in New Jersey. How do we, if we're going to go, David, as you said, from 15, 17% to 80%, and we've got a primary election right now where we already know turnout typically is very low, but it's also a chance to practice before the general election. And that's not to say that we don't have contested primary elections coming up, an important election in this primary, but we've got to get everything in place for us in July so that we are ready to go in November, when it is, you know, it's all in when it comes to the election.
I would just add, I don't know if the clerk's offices are open right now or not. I'm going to guess they're probably not open. So if you are turning 18 between now and November of 2020, how are you supposed to register to vote if we don't offer some form of online? When you think about the massive number of people who register to vote, who begin to participate, who get involved and interested in a presidential election year, all of the places where people get registered, county fairs, you know, voter registration drives, community events outside the supermarket, all of these things are not going to be happening over the next few months, and we don't know when they'll be happening again. So we need to be creative and innovative in this moment, and we need to not worry about security. We need to not let fear of voter fraud stop us from innovating when voter fraud has not, in fact, been the problem. And the bigger problem will be if all of these people who want to get involved and to have their voice heard in 2020 can't do it.
I will say to you that I don't register people in my office, but the county, my office does have a skeleton crew in, and we are processing vote by mail applications and mailing out ballots. And the superintendent of elections office does have a skeleton crew in, and they are registering people, not at the numbers that they would normally, but they are registering people. And that is a concern. And I don't think there's a real security issue with regard to online voter registration. There might be more of a concern with regard to internet voting. And I think everybody in the entire audience would agree with that. But I don't see a problem with that, because we now have it where you can register by mail, and then you can show an ID once when you get to the polls, and then you're registered forever. And there are other ways, so I don't see why that would be a problem. But I know that's all up to the legislature. They will vote for it.
Thanks. So this is one of those tell us what you think questions, and it's really for all of you. It's a two-parter, and feel free to answer only one part, but we're interested in knowing the top 3 things we can do to fight voter suppression in this country. What do you think the top 3 are? And the second part is, if you could change anything in the current political and electoral landscape, what would it be?
The president.
That's too easy. I take it. Who wants to go first? Dave?
It's a great question, and I'm stalling here as I think about a good answer to this great question. I'm thinking about November, and I'm thinking about how the thing I think we need to change is to be certain that everybody can vote in November, and that this election goes off as it needs to, because it's a crucial election, not just the presidency, but all of these down ballot elections and the state legislators that will be drawing district lines and maps after the census that we live on for the next decade. So we have 200 days left to try and safeguard this. If there's something I could change, it would be the overall environment that has made voting rights a political football. It's become so politicized. And I think that this has been an intentional effort by one side that has used misnomers and myths about voter fraud to, while gerrymandering and passing all these voter ID laws that have actually introduced real suppression into the system. And we've made all of this so partisan that here we are in the midst of an emergency, and we have to do something nonpartisan to secure the election. And you've got the president talking about how, well, we can't possibly do that because that would, introduce levels of new voting into the system that would be crazy. Or you've got, all of these, senators, when we try to get, funding for vote by mail in the last stimulus package, who say things like, I don't see the connection between voting and a pandemic. Well, if you don't see the connection between voting and a pandemic, I suggest you look at the pictures out of Wisconsin a couple weeks ago, and let's make it a national priority not to repeat that in November of 2020.
Thanks. Andrew?
Yeah, something interesting happened in Wisconsin, something heartwarming, which is the results, given all of the suppression that was going on, and given the fact that people were willing to stand in line for hours, socially distant. But look at the outcome there as well. And so the question becomes, what is voter registration going to look like in this age? What is turnout going to look like? There's some really unique opportunity specifically now to get involved, whether it is with phone banking, whether it is with emailing, whether it is, in your neighborhood or in your community, making sure people are registered to vote, that they just know that the primary, the first one coming up is the primary, that they just know so many of our neighbors, everyone on this Zoom call is already voting, always votes. But so many of our immediate surrounding networks, you'd be shocked at how many people don't actually vote. And so it is the usual starting within your smaller circle and then building outward. And if I could change one thing, I would say it is to make elections and make, especially people who feel so disenfranchised, feel like their voice is being heard. And the only way that's going to happen, of course, it's sort of a catch-22, is to ensure that we elect people who are listening to the people who are disenfranchised in the first place. But I am guardedly, cautiously optimistic about what's going to happen over the next 200 days.
Let's see here.
Thank you. Paula?
Oh, well, I think voter ID laws obviously are a problem because they start talking about fraud, and then people believe that there is fraud. And as David pointed out, we really don't have a lot of fraud in elections, very, very minimal. And additionally, we need to make sure that people are not feeling intimidated about voting, because that's the other way that people are suppressed. The vote is suppressed when people are intimidated, when there are a police presence outside of polling locations, when people are threatened in some way. So that's something that we've got to work. And then we've got to also make sure that the polls are well staffed and accessible. Those are just the basic things that we need to make sure are happening. And we saw in Georgia a few years ago that there were some real problems with accessibility to polling locations and intimidation. And we've got to just be vigilant on all of that. And as election workers, that is something that we'll run out if we hear that there's an intimidation situation happening. We send a lawyer out right to the polls on election day to deal with it and to put it down. But it happens every election in one polling location or another. And things like someone calls it a bomb threat when there is no bomb threat, just to close a poll in an urban area. That happened to us a few years ago. So there are all types of things that happen, and we are trained and we are prepared to deal with them. But that is the kind of thing that, we can, as election officials, we've got to just be prepared for anything, because you never know what's going to happen, but it happens every time.
We do have some questions about, general subterfuge. For example, you mentioned calling in a bomb threat, but we also had literature being dropped in Princeton where an entire voting precinct was told their polling place had moved. Then the committee person had to hurry up and run around and call and knock on doors and say, that's just a total lie. Go where you normally vote.
Yeah.
What about subterfuge along the lines of hacking from, outside influences, whether it's the Russians or somebody who just wants to be a disruptor? Not intentional, not within the office itself, but the hackers. What about that?
Well, one thing is they need to let us know immediately. If they let the county officials know, we can then get word out on the official websites. Like, for example, Princeton District 2, it is not down. You know what I mean? We can get word out. We can speak with the police. We can reach out to people. So they need to call the county election officials immediately. We can even call the state police. They're on call on election day, ready to deal with any kind of intimidation or bomb threat or anything like that. So we need to know. We can help that way. So that's important that you raise that. What was the other thing?
Thanks. Andrew, anything to say about what do we do about hacking? Or Dave?
I think there's a good reason why we've not moved towards full-blown internet voting, and that's because the studies on this show that the security level isn't there yet for whatever reason. I mean, why that is, I don't completely know. Why we're able to do online banking but not online voting seems to me like a a good question to ask, but the safety and security just isn't there yet. So we haven't moved in that direction, but there is not that same problem with vote by mail. It's just not there. So we should feel really safe and secure with it.
When your credit card gets hacked, you can make an appeal to your bank and get your money back.
Yeah.
When your democracy gets hacked, it's hard to get your election back.
You can't ask Putin for it.
Thanks. Before I sort of sum up, any other remarks, anything on anyone's mind before we?
I just want to add one. David talked about innovation. So one thing that hasn't come up, and I know we're wrapping up, so I'll just throw it out there. But a couple of years ago, I was in Portland, Oregon on election day. I had done my vote by mail ballot already. They have secure drop boxes, large, enormous drop boxes all over the city. And so it was another way to allow people to get their ballots in when it was convenient. And I just watched it for a few minutes, and people just matter-of-factly threw their ballot into the secure Dropbox with a camera looking at it. It was enormous. I mean, it would be very difficult to steal. I think New Jersey in particular has to think about adding this, because to get to that 70, 80, 90%, whatever we're going to do when it comes to vote by mail, without overwhelming the clerks like you're talking about, this is another way to try to get as many people for the ease of voting as possible. So I'll just throw that out there, but there has been discussion about how we might fund this, how we might set this up and educate people about this.
I wanted to, to back that up, Andrew, I agree. And I think that the municipal clerk's offices would be a great place to start with the drop-offs, because people feel like Trenton from Princeton is another world. And if they could go to their municipal clerk, and that's the same in Hamilton and in West Windsor and all over our county, that would be a great way to start. Those if they're election officials, the municipal clerks, and they're bonded and they have security in the buildings, and the buildings are handicap accessible. So I think it's a good place to start. And I'm trying to push that, because eventually we're going to have to go to early voting as well. I think some states have early voting where you can vote in a voting machine before election day. And if we could start maybe with municipal clerk's offices, that would be something that we could consider. So it's something that I think would be a good way to start it. And then maybe go to parks later, as we get better at this. Yeah.
I just also add, before all this started, I've been working on legislation to do a pilot program around early voting for exactly the reason you're talking about.
Great. And drop boxes will be added to that, right? Thanks. David, any parting words?
There's a lot to be optimistic about in our democracy. There has been so many amazing citizen movements over these last couple of years, and they are making a difference. Democracies are hard to keep, and ours perhaps is more fragile than we imagined it was, and that's why it needs all of us. I mean, Dr. King talked about the moral arc of the universe being long but bending towards justice, and it don't bend by itself. It bends when all of us grab it and pull it, but we got to keep our hands on it. We can't take it off in between elections and think that everything is going to go okay. We need to keep those hands on that arc and pulling it in the direction we want it to go all the time.
Thanks. And so basically we want people to fill out their vote by mail applications, mail it in. We want people to participate in online voter registration drives, and more soon on how to do that. I personally don't know yet, but there are ways, and we will be pushing that out. We want to encourage our circle and network of friends to apply for their vote by mail ballot and to actually vote. And we really want to flood the governor's office with calls, emails, and letters, pushing the issue for a vote by mail, all vote by mail election, and some action with executive orders, making that happen and making online voter registration a reality. There is, I'm going to send out after the meeting with Andrew's slides a PowerPoint deck that has a link to when we all vote, which you may have heard Michelle Obama is one of the founders, really encouraging us to push vote by mail and moving away from voting in person. Early voting, vote by mail, and it's important. I just signed on today. I took a pledge. I'll send it to you in some information. You can take a look. It's a nonpartisan effort. So many of our Blue Wave was a nonpartisan effort. We've really come together as a community, and our sister organizations have been wonderful to work with on really important critical issues. And we're going to keep doing that, and we're going to have a great year. So thanks everybody for participating. Thanks to our special guests, and thanks to Heather Howard and Bill Schofield. And look at that book, Unrigged, published by Live Right, which is a W.W. Norton imprint. And it's really a great read, and I highly recommend it. And that's not just because David Daly is sitting here. Thanks again for joining us, and everybody take care.
Thank you.
Good night.